next speaker is James Miller, who was taught at Johns Hopkins University and Georgetown University. And prior to that, he served for 20 years at the State Department in a variety of positions, including editor of the documentary series Foreign Relations in the United States. He did research and analysis work, and was an instructor and ultimately chairman of the program in European and Eurasian Studies at the Foreign Service Institute. He is the author of 5 books on Southern European history, including The United States in the Making of Modern Greece from 2009. His books have won awards from the American Historical Association, the Society of American Historians, and the Society of Historians of American Foreign Relations, as well as the SABR Macmillan Award in Sports History. In 2000, he received the Secretary of State's Career Achievement Award, and Miller has taught at 5 European universities, 3 times as a Fulbright Scholar. His current writing project is Playing Catch-Up, Modernization in Southern Europe since 1700. And his talk for us today is When the Tail Wagged the Dog, the United States and the Greek Junta in 1967 to 1973.
Thank you. First of all, can everybody hear me? I'm notoriously a slow-voiced kind of a guy. I want to start off by talking a little bit about what I call the yin and yang of American foreign policy. And I want to trace this back to the beginnings of the modern American-Greek relationship, that is, the relationship that developed from 47 on. The generation of American leaders who exited from the Second World War in positions of power and influence were very aware and really focused their foreign policy conceptualization on the notion of the limits of American power. And this is very much reflected in the way in which budgeting was done by the United States between, say, 1945 and 1970, the arrival of the 69-70, the arrival of the Nixon administration. Simply put, the United States had a certain amount of disposable income to invest in foreign affairs and to improve its own international position. But it was not going to go beyond that limit because it was struggling mightily to retain its balance of payments and also its balance of its budget. So you then come to the point that no society, and particularly a society that's regarded as the major world power, can simply allow its power to be seen as naked. And what do you do about a situation like that? Well, the answer is you find a way to assert the predominance of your power. And this is, again, a major theme of American foreign policy from the 1940s, really up until the present day. The way you do this, American leaders concluded, was by establishing leverage. And that leverage would support the deficits, the weaknesses in your budgeting and in general in your power relationships. One way you could do this was deep involvement with international organizations, deep in the sense of investing in those organizations in such a way that you had a very strong voice, sometimes an absolutely dominant voice. Another way you could do it was through alliance relationships. And this is one of the parts that Professor Pell's, I think, his work is really underlined. The most important relationships that the United States developed in the post-war era were, ironically, with the countries it defeated in World War II, that is Japan and Germany. Less so with Italy, but even Italy is sort of important in all of this. So that from the beginning, the position of the United States was heavily influenced by its ability to share burdens with other societies. And these allies became critical to giving the United States a much wider sway in international affairs, and also maintaining a certain level of American investment, particularly its financial side, in the rest of the world. Now, this, the development of what we call the containment policy, which is basically an expression of these two concerns of limits of power and predominance of powers, begins in an ironic way in 1946, just as the Greek crisis is beginning to boil up. So between roughly the middle of 1946 and the beginnings of 1947, the Truman administration went from a general conception about predominance of power and also of limits of power to actually developing a program to deal with Western Europe's crises. And the crisis situation was, how do you take a limited amount of financial resources and put them at the service of the Europeans and simultaneously put them in services of the United States? The answer to this, of course, was eventually the Marshall Plan, which was, well, I always used to ask people this question, what was the Marshall Plan? Does anybody have a quick definition of it? What did Secretary Marshall actually say when he made his famous speech in June of 1947? It's amazing. No one ever reads the speech. The speech boiled down into its simplest context was, we have some money. Now, it's incumbent on you to come up with a plan to use that money, and it has to be a European-wide plan. So this becomes one of the areas in which the United States furthered its own interests by furthering the process of European integration. As my colleague mentioned, one of the countries that was immediately included in the Marshall Plan, although in sort of political geographic terms it wasn't much of a fit, was Greece. And Greece had become a symbol of Washington's determination to confront the Soviet Union on a whole series of issues. And the way in which one approached the Greek issue was, in a sense, a trial run for the Marshall Plan. When Truman addressed the Congress of the United States in March of 1947, the United States already had a 6-month warning from the British that they were about to leave Greece and that they were about to leave the situation hanging. And the question was, what kind of response was the United States going to make? It was a very difficult situation because if the British, with their limited power, were not able to do very much with the Greeks, I should say their limited power, but lots of experience in intervening in Greek affairs, what was the United States going to do that was any better? The response to this was the development of a 3-pronged program, which is all laid out quite simply in the Truman address to Congress. First of all, Greece has an immediate civil war problem. The second problem the Greeks have is that their economy is essentially collapsed. And the third fundamental problem is that their political system doesn't work very well. What are we going to do about this? Well, the answer was, in many ways, almost a paradigm of future American involvement worldwide. We're going to send military advisors and equipment to the Greek army. We are then going to provide economic aid, and even before the Marshall Plan, you'll recall, we had both a special program for Greece outlined by the Truman Doctrine, and also interim aid for Greece and a number of other countries that were going to be entering the Marshall system. The third part is a little vaguer, but I think it consisted largely in 2 things. First of all, nudging the Greeks in one way or another to create a system of stable parliamentary government. And secretly, secretly, because we really don't know a lot about this, but secretly providing funds for the Greek political parties so that A, they could win national elections, and B, eventually, as this program expanded in the late 50s, the Greek parties would be able to improve their own political infrastructures and become more solid citizens. We'll get to that in a minute. The program was a surprising success from the beginning, and a lot of that is due to the Greeks themselves. It turned out that the majority of Greeks were quite willing to fight for their own independence from a communist-controlled government. So Washington provided equipment, Washington provided training, and the Greeks did the rest of it. The happy outcome for the Americans was that during the Civil War period of 1947-49, there was exactly 1 military casualty, and this was a gentleman who unfortunately took off with a Greek pilot in a Helldiver bomber, and the bomber crashed not due to enemy action, but rather just to a failure in the system. The second part, which was also largely successful, was the Marshall Plan's intervention in the Greek economy. I point out that the Marshall Plan intervention was in itself relatively limited, although in economic terms it was quite something. The United States, by 1950, had pumped $1 billion US into Greece, which in $1 billion 1947 terms was a lot of money. It's not like $1 billion now where, you just throw it around hither and thither. So that the money was focused on a couple of issues. One was modernizing Greece's agrarian structure, and the other was largely infrastructural in nature. And this responded to a very critical Greek need, and that is the already ongoing and then extraordinarily expanded after the Civil War migration of Greeks from the countryside into the city, and the questions that relate to what happens when a good portion of your population begins to suddenly become urbanites. So these programs succeeded. They succeeded well early, and they formed the basis upon which later American operations were conducted. The effort to reform Greek politics was a not so much. In 1950-52, U.S. embassy officials repeatedly intervened inside Greece's complicated political structure to try to push the Greeks in the direction of a proportional representation system, so-called reinforced proportional representation, which would guarantee the Greeks had a stable government. And eventually they arrived at this in the election of 1952 with Marshal Papadakis, which was a major achievement. And then, as I said, the secret operation seemed to have kicked in sometime in the 50s. Initially, I frankly don't know a lot about this, and I don't think anybody else does either, but if we're to take a look at this, initially the American method of influencing political elections was at the last moment, and the immediate prelude to the election itself was to put a fair amount of money on the table and covertly provide it to Greek political parties. We don't know anything about the data. We can presume that Papadakis' coalition got the largest sum of this money, if he was receiving it at this point, and probably the parties in the so-called center-left received some. By 1958, in the wake of an EDA surprise victory, in quotation marks, in that election, the United States apparently, and again I'm drawing primarily from comments that were made either in oral history interviews or occasionally published in memoirs, but the United States apparently put in a full-time civic action program using CIA money. We know a lot about the civic action program because a similar one was introduced in Italy about 1953 and continued to about 1960, and was reasonably successful in influencing Italian politics. So it seems to have provided a model for the CIA's subsequent operations in Greece. And as one American official at the time put it, as a result of the 58 election, the CIA scared the hell out of everybody and insisted on fuller participation in the activities in Greece. So these were some of the important effects of the 1947 decision. But the success of the Greek regime in itself, or in the Greek situation, in improving political stability in Greece suggested to American policymakers that in fact there needed to be a reevaluation of the amount of money that was being put into Greece and the amount of effort that was being made in Greece. Put in its simplest terms, it looked like Greece had stabilized itself, and the subsequent arrival of Karamanlis in power reinforced that perception. So basically from 1950 to about 1963, 61, 63, American involvement in Greece was already on the downslide in terms of economic and other forms of assistance. And this, needless to say, did not please the Greek government because they argued rather forcefully that, first of all, the Americans had a commitment to them, and second of all, that it was too early in the economic recovery of the country to be slicing off American aid. But the response to the Eisenhower administration was simply that we're going to have less money to deal with anyway. The Marshall Plan was a one-time only kind of a contribution to your welfare. You're going to have to send us to in one room in these matters. So kind of a decoupling of American Greek strategic interests at a very early stage. This did not mean, because the United States still provided basic security shield for Greece, this did not mean a decoupling of all American-Greek relationships. But it did make the situation a lot choppier and a lot more difficult to control. And you see that a lot in the diplomatic correspondence coming out of Greece, where it became the habit of Greek officials to simply rake American embassy officials over the coals about the lack of financial support for the Greek position. In any case, what the United States essentially had done was to leave the Greeks with certain large unanswered questions that they were going to have to work out themselves. The political ones were fairly obvious. The monarchy and its relation to the rest of the country, the military and its relationship both to the monarchy and to the position of the political parties, the strengthening of the political system through a development of really much stronger and less personality influenced political parties. These were left largely to the Greeks to deal with. And in addition to this, and it's something that should have popped up by now and definitely should pop up at this point, there's the wonderful issue of Cyprus. We, as historians, used to sort of think that the 1922 disaster in the Near East, in Anatolia, was the end of the Megali Idea. But I think it's better to say that it was a refocusing of the notion of getting all Greeks possible into a single Greek state. Turkey basically eliminated this problem, if you want, for the Greeks by expelling 1.3, 1.5 million Greek speakers from Turkey in 1922-23, and therefore that issue was pretty much off the table. But remaining on the table and a really strong pull on the Greek imagination was, of course, the island of Cyprus. The one area in which you had a Greek-speaking majority of folks who were not, at this point, inside the Greek state, and in fact were, I wouldn't say suffering, but were under colonial rule, and particularly under the colonial rule of the United States' good old friend and closest ally in many ways, the British. So the context of American-Greek relations changed dramatically as the Cyprus problem emerges, and as the Greeks put considerable pressure on the United States to do something about it. The ironic part of this is that while the Americans were largely unwilling to do anything about it, they basically agreed that the best solution would be Enesis. However, it would have to be Enesis that was in a modified form, that is some kind of pourboire had to be offered to the Turks in order to achieve this goal. And American and Greek relations really shipwreck on the notion of what the pourboire should be. So this becomes a problem introduced by the Greeks themselves, which then impedes a lot of other issues relating to the United States-Greek relationship, and from Cyprus you make the immediate leap into the stability of NATO's eastern flank. I would remind you that in this context, in evaluating the position of various players in the Eastern Mediterranean, Greece, after 1950, was the number 3 player. That is to say, the primary player was initially the UK, and that would be the case until about 1960, when the UK bugged out of Cyprus and left the situation pretty much in American hands. And then the other primary player was Turkey. Turkey, with a population about 6 times that of Greece, Turkey a frontline state in the real sense of the word, because it shares a large common border with the Soviet Union. Turkey, which could mobilize a very large military force, and Turkey, which was a member state of NATO as well as Greece. In fact, not to degrade the Greeks, but just to make the obvious point, the decision to set up a southern flank was largely about Turkey. And the Greeks kind of were pulled along into NATO after some analysis of whether they really belonged in a military sense, but also with the hope, which were briefly carried forward, that Turkey and Greece would find a modus vivendi working inside NATO, and also that they would, with this is usually forgotten, but they would with Yugoslavia constitute a firm barrier against Soviet expansion into the Balkans. And the Second Balkan Pact in 1953 is the outcome of all of this. Well, as we know, that's not the way it worked. The Greeks, having brought this issue to the table, received a rather hearty slapping from both the British and the Turks. And I suppose in the long run of things, the British management of this issue was not all that important, but arousing Turkish nationalism on this issue was just the wrong way to go. Karamanlis understood this, and in 1956, 57, 58, 59, 60, maneuvered to try to find a way in which Cyprus could eventually be brought back into the Greek orbit, but primarily, ultimately, through the arrangements of the London-Zurich discussions, which created an independent Cyprus, but one that was subject both to British, Turkish, and Greek sort of control mechanisms. And the issue was left there when Karamanlis left power in 1963. So these issues were all very much on the agenda of Greek foreign ministers and politicians during the 1960s. And the internal dynamic that led to the coup of 1967 was largely Greek-produced. It was about internal Greek issues, and it was about, obviously, about the issue of Cyprus. So by 1967, then, the Greek political system goes aground, and the situation permits a group of military men to intervene in the name of national unity and in the name of solving these national problems related to a faltering political system. What happens once this takes place? Now, generally speaking, when I was growing up, the emphasis on that the man in the street put on this was that it was all the result of a struggle between the Americans on one side and the Papandreous on the other. I think it's clear that that is not the case, but it would be a mistake not to realize the dynamic that the Papandreous, in particular Andreas, engineered in the 1960s, which made American-Greek relations even more fraught. Essentially, Andreas and his father latched onto the Cyprus issue, first the father in 1960 and then the son in 64 after he successfully returned to Greece and run for public office, as an issue that had to be solved in Greek terms, and Washington had to be pressured into working with the Greeks. This effort, this policy shipwrecked itself in the summer of 1964. And in writing about this, I refer to it as a dialogue of the deaf, because President Johnson, this is really his only major involvement in Greek affairs during the entire period of his presidency, called the Greeks and the Turks together in Washington to try to negotiate a way out of this. The Turks were more forthcoming, the Greeks were less forthcoming. Papandreou eventually arrives in Washington and almost immediately wraps himself in the national flag and announces that there are no concessions to be made. Only Turkey will make concessions. Greece will hold true to its national interests and its national destiny. Interestingly enough, by the way, when he finished this little talk, he went to Paris, where de Gaulle raked him over the carpet for his attitudes and told him that this was not the kind of behavior that he would expect out of what was effectively, if you'll pardon me for saying this, a third-rate European state. So this certainly complicated things, and there's little doubt that the American embassy was full of people who were just hated Andreas Papandreou, and that the embassy in general was reporting to Washington that Andreas victory. George had already sort of been discounted because of his age and so forth in Greek elections in expected Greek elections in 1967 would be an absolute disaster for American interests. The result of this was that on the verge of the coup, which everybody hoped to avoid and everybody foresaw, the various elements of the Greek political system were all insistently pushing Washington to do something, and Washington's reaction was basically no but. The no being that you shouldn't have a coup, and the but being, by the way, can we somehow avoid a Papandreou government? This confusion helped to trigger the sequence of events that leads up to the coup, but it was certainly not an objective of American foreign policy. Once the coup takes place, we're in a new world. The political class is swept away. And in many cases, I'm just really interested in what you said about the day of the coup, because I had a Greek roommate in 1967, 68, and he had exactly the same story to tell about the music and the slogans and the total confusion as to whether these guys were the left or the right or what was going on. But the U.S. response was, frankly, kind of flaccid. The Johnson administration was, by April of 1967, badly wounded. The Vietnam War was now in its third year, Public discontent with the war was raging, and I remember this on a personal level because I was one of the raging rioters at various university campuses. And the government, the situation had gotten so bad that Johnson literally could go nowhere except American military bases to make policy statements. That's the only place where he could be assured of a friendly audience. So the government was weakened. The arrival of the Greek coup was something that was unexpected and unwanted. But when the seat of Greek, director of Greek affairs, in those days, by the way, State Department had a huge number of jobs, and none of which exist anymore. We have a sort of a desk officer now for Greece, Cyprus, and Turkey, and that's about it. When the director of Greek affairs arrived to talk to Secretary Russ that morning, Russ looked at him in a very outraged sort of look and said to him effectively, look, I've been through 93 coups in my time as Secretary of State. I'm not going to get my nose bent out of joint about this one. And generally the reaction of the Johnson administration is this is not an issue we really want to get ourselves involved in. The embassy was, to give them credit, upset about it and made the famous reference to the coup as the rape of Greek democracy. But in point of fact, is the Americans looked at this situation, pinned down as the administration was in Vietnam, there really weren't very many options left in terms of reacting to it. And so it adopted a kind of a minimalist program of non-recognition and suppression of heavy arms sales or delivery of heavy arms to the Greeks. Somebody made a very good point this morning, by the way, and it was entirely right, that in so doing, they really had no effect on the colonels because in order to deal with a restless population, you don't need tanks and artillery, you need machine guns and hand grenades and so forth and so on, those same light weapons. So the effect of the freeze was virtually nothing on the Greeks' immediate capacity, Junta's immediate capacity to keep its restless population under control. In the situation in which there were few options and they were all bad, the use of force was ruled out. Many of you probably have seen the cable in which the U.S. Ambassador Phillips Talbot remarks that when the king came in to see him after the coup, he was blazing angry, and he told him to send in the Marines, send in the fleet, send in the Marines. First of all, the fleet wasn't there, and second of all, sending the fleet and the Marines into an allied country, where were you going to land them? I've always wondered this. How were you going to supply them? Were you going to bombard a major Greek city in order to allow the U.S. military to enter? The notion that you could basically frighten the junta into capitulation never strikes me as a very sensible argument. It was, by the way, Bob Keeley, who later became ambassador to Greece, but at the time he was a junior embassy officer, has always held that the junta would have folded if you'd sent the U.S. Navy into Flaring Bay. But I think that's a big question mark. The junta doesn't look like they're going to drop over at the threat, and furthermore, which one is it? Patakos was the first guy to talk to an American official after the coup, said, well, we know you don't love us, but we're here and you got to learn to live with us. That doesn't strike me as the guy was particularly afraid of American threats. What followed then was a kind of a slow march, and maybe not that slow a march, a gradual march into de facto recognition of the coup and of the junta as Greece's legitimate government between December of 67 and January of 69. Johnson administration slowly surrendered position after position on its non-recognition agenda. And by 69, the U.S. was essentially in contact with the Greeks at all levels. It was working once again with the Greek government, this time the junta government. Things changed, however, dramatically in 1969 when Richard Nixon arrived in power. The Johnson administration was very dubious about the junta. Nixon, on the other hand, was very enthusiastic about the junta. And in fact, there's a funny moment where Kissinger and Al Haig, who are then his two principal National Security Council advisors, had to restrain the president from jumping into this situation and giving the Greeks arms before they could figure out a justification for doing it or ending the arms embargo. And those of you who have ever been in a government agency might recognize the scenario where from the bowels of the institution there comes a policy paper in which you're given three options, two of which are ridiculous, and the third of which is the one they prefer. Nixon missed this one. He missed it entirely. He took the more radical approach, the one that Haig and Kissinger didn't want, so they had to spend, literally, there's the sort of exchange of notes between the two of them. He's done this. Now what do we do? How do we get him to pull back? So, in any case, after 1969, it is a full-time embrace of the junta. President Eisenhower died in March of '69, which gave the Greeks an opportunity to send a delegation to Washington. King Constantine, who I had not mentioned, but who obviously was by this time a sideline player after the failure of his counter-coup in '67, showed up in Washington too. Andreas Papandreou could not be far behind and in fact was lurking around the edges of all this. Everybody was trying to get to Nixon, and the president determined that, first of all, the king would meet with Spiro Agnew, he would meet with Patakos, and nobody would meet with Andreas, obviously. So the decisions were basically made in the first weeks of the Nixon administration. And to the end of the Nixon administration, there was full-time cooperation with the Greek government. This was the preferred way of going. It took them time to leach out the suspension of the arms embargo. They had to lay the domestic groundwork for that. But once that was over, it's full speed ahead. Home porting for the Greek fleet, a variety of other delights that seemed to serve. The reason for this, as best I can figure, based on the documentation, is that the Nixon administration put everything in the context of the Cold War and believed that Greece had 10 reliable divisions that it would supply to NATO in case of trouble. And in doing this, it seems to me that it ignored the basic fact that once a military gains power, fissures and fractionalization take place at a rapid rate, and there was no telling exactly what the combat status of the Greek army was. We found out in 1974 at the time of the Cyprus crisis, but essentially the Greek army had become so heavily politicized, not simply at the senior levels, which was now colonels and so forth, generally promoted to general, but also at the lower level of captains and majors, that it was really a political party as much as it was a military force. So the net result of all of this was that by 1973, the United States had no policy for Greece except support for the junta. And in 1973, the Greek government was overthrown. This was the last Papadopoulos, the sort of, what do you want to call it, semi-parliamentarian regime that was supposed to transition to something more like a democracy. Up to this point, the U.S. ambassador in his name I'm going to forget for a moment, but he's going to come to me. It's who's the U.S. ambassador?
Henry Tasca.
Yeah, Henry Tasca, who had made his entire career in Athens explaining that we had to stick with Papadopoulos because the alternatives were terrible.
Nobody believed him.
He was right. It turned out on that one issue he was right. At that point, Tasca jumped ship and begins to try to find a way out of the crisis that involves bringing Karamanlis back to power. Kissinger was having absolutely none of this. And he wanted the junta to remain, he wanted the junta to shut up, and then he was totally surprised in July of 1974 when the admittedly greasy and hard to figure out mercurial head of the new government, no one was allowed to talk to anyway, proceeded to promote a coup on the island. Now, not that he wasn't warned. There's something like 18 intelligence reports on his desk saying that something's going to pop in Cyprus, and the one that said it wasn't, and Henry decided to pick the one that said nothing was going to happen, because when you're a policymaker, that's always the best thing to do. Nothing will happen. So in any case, that was the end of the story, except for the violent conclusion to all of this. The Greek government attacked the Greek Cypriot government, caused plenty of casualties, produced a Turkish intervention, and then Henry Kissinger had his last moment of managing Greek affairs, which at first was to side with the junta, and then when the junta was overthrown, to side with the Turks. Which in many ways is the most logical move he made in the entire crisis, because, I mean, the Turks countered and the junta didn't, but on the other hand, it left the new democratic government of Greece out to dry. It had no friends. The British weren't going to support them either. So the net result of all this was, in a sense, you could say that in 1947, the United States and Greece got married. The United States played the traditional role of the great power protector of the Greeks. By 1954, the United States had kind of tended to lose its influence over Greek affairs because it wasn't delivering very much. By 1967, when it blinked at the junta, it either fell further in Greek estimation, and in 1974, it just fell off the table. The United States was no longer in any position to carry out this role. So it might be a story of marriage, divorce, and then they lived amicably ever after. The Germans moved in step by step and took over the same position. The Germans initially under the guise of the European Union, but ultimately under the guise of the Germans, took the role over. And I'm going to avoid making any comments about the way in which the Germans managed the most recent Greek crisis, but it really is almost a replay of what the Americans experienced in Greece without the nasty language from the American side. So I'll shut up there.
All right, well, let's thank our two panelists. And we have some time now for questions, a little bit, or
12 minutes.
12 minutes, okay. So, questions from the audience?
What caused,
Sorry.
I think, sorry, in 1967, prior to the coup, with some cables from the embassy in Athens that you mentioned, they were sending back information to the administration that they were worried about a Greek civil war. And that's why I think the fleet sent the carrier group outside Phaleron, led by the USS America, for the purpose of, if there was a civil war, to evacuate U.S. citizens.
Yeah, that's undoubtedly the case. I don't remember. I don't know. I should remember because I saw every damn one of them. But no. But the real issue was where did the Marines come in, and how are you actually going to achieve a successful military operation against a NATO ally? Try that one out for size. We just invaded NATO. So it was really never a rational response to the situation.
I was going to ask you, what actually caused the fall of Papadopoulos and the rise of Ioannidis? Deep causes, not Polytechnion, that might be a symptom.